that's given to the present plays that are being written, but they come under the same category. If you look at the features of a sentimental comedy, where the preaching is done in the garb of entertainment, and at the same time you also find that it's not just preaching, but along with that there is entertainment and the expressing the moral sentiments. So expression of moral sentiments is of prime importance in sentimental comedy, and therefore the name sentimental comedy. German dramatist Brecht, he was born in 1898. He was instrumental in actually promoting, or rather dealing with, political and social problems. Right. So political and social problems are being highlighted. So what is right and what is wrong is pointed out through this sentimental comedy. Now, when a lot of preaching happens, it is believed that there is no scope for any entertainment. There is no scope for any laughter, and therefore sentimental comedy, it's believed that it leads to the death of comedy. And it has been observed that still sentimental comedy and some of the sentimental comedies which came later also led to the death of comedy. After having discussed romantic comedy, comedy of humor, comedy of manners, sentimental comedy, we have come to the last type of comedy, that is the black or the dark comedy. The word black itself shows that there is some kind of bitterness, there's some kind of cynicism, there's something that black color or the dark, the word dark, the phrase dark comedy is associated with unpleasantness. So these are some of the qualities that you find in a black or a dark comedy. It is cynical, it is bitter, it is unpleasant, and anti-heroic and anti-romantic characters are the ones that you find, because you don't find heroic qualities in the protagonist. You'll find that the protagonist is anti-heroic, he's anti-romantic. So it's totally against the norms of what a comedy has to be. Unusual mixture of tragedy and comedy. What happens in a dark comedy is there's a blend, there's a mixture. It's not a pure form of comedy as we believe. Comedy has to be where it only entertains, makes people laugh, as we have studied what comedy, the intention of a comedy is. So this unusual mixture of tragedy and comedy, the social consciousness and human warmth, as in Vesker's trilogy, there is also this element of satire. So again, dark comedy or a black comedy also highlights the negatives of the society. It creates a social consciousness. It makes the society aware of the negativities that are prevalent in the society. It's pointing fingers to that. And then it's not like there is everything happy happening. It's not that it's throughout the comedy, this particular type of comedy where you find a lot of laughter. It's a blend. So there's a mixture of tragedy and a comedy. It's not a pure kind of a comedy as we have understood. If you've understood the definition of comedy, where there's romance, there's a happy ending, and everything is so much in sync and harmony, but you don't find that in a dark comedy. As we have understood that with the change of time, the form also evolves. So comedy as a form has also evolved because the society has evolved, and literature is a reflection of life. and therefore that is also seen. So the element of satire is something that has to be there in most of the comedies that we have studied earlier, the different types of comedy that we've studied. So it is also evident here. Now, if we have to look at the dark comedy during the Shakespeare's age, Measure for Measure and Troilus and Cressida. Troilus and Cressida is again, there's a Trojan War and everything is being discussed. That's the background. So it is not a very sunny picture throughout the play because there's war which is being discussed at the background. And Shakespeare's Measure for Measure is also one of the dark comedies. Now, when we talk about phrases like tragicomedy and comic tragedy, they are being used because there is this blend. There is some tragic element, some comic element, and therefore we either call it tragicomedy or comic tragedy. These are phrases which have been coined and are being used. But when we are using it for a serious drama, it's an incorrect phrase which should never be used. After having discussed the comedy, since we are talking about the play, there's something called, when we talk about the dark comedy, we cannot avoid this particular aspect, theatre of the absurd. This some of the major works: Harold Pinter's The Birthday Party, Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, and N.F. Simpson's Resounding. These are some of the plays of theatre of absurd. American dramatist Edward Albee's Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is also one such play which comes under the category of theatre of absurd. Now, what we discussed till now, the 5 types of comedy: the romantic comedy, the comedy of humor, comedy of manner, sentimental comedy, and finally we talked about the dark and the dark comedy. These are the 5 types of comedy. But since we are discussing comedy, we'll further look at some of the major writers who belong to these categories. So let's look at John Lilly's works. This particular information that we are discussing here has been taken from Alfred Upham's book, which is also a referred text for students of Gujarat University. The Typical Forms of English Literature, that's the name of the text, and the author is Alfred Upham, wherein he talks about, there is a chapter on comedy where he talks about Lilly's comedies. Lilly's comedies play a major role because it's been instrumental in influencing the later comedies of English literature, and therefore John Lilly's contribution to the form of comedy is important. And where did it come from? It's a hybrid form bred of the Plotin, that is Plautus, that is a Roman as well as Italian. So there's a mixture. Plautus and Terence are the first, if we go back in the history, not of English literature but the Latin, then you will find that Plautus and Terence have written comedies, and it's a mixture of what the two of them have written. So you'll find, Plotin tradition as well as the Italian pastoral drama. It's a blend of the two which you find in Lilly's comedies. We discussed the romantic comedies. So most of the points that we discussed earlier, the features that we discussed earlier, you can find them in most of the comedies written during the Elizabethan age. Most of the comedies written by Shakespeare also has these particular features. So there is romance. There's this pastoral background. You will find idyllic background here. or it could be heroic with its high-born personages. The people who takes the center stage in these comedies are high-born personages. Extravagant sentiment and adventure. You will find excessive feelings and emotions, because Elizabethan age is known for the emotions as well. And adventure, there's a free flowing emotions here and adventure. The plots would be kind of long rambling plots that you find in this particular comedy, and the settings would be very, very artificial. When we look at again the Elizabethan dramatists, when we talk about, how can we not again discuss about comedies of Shakespeare? You will find that in the romantic comedies of Shakespeare, it's not just one story. There would be multiple stories. Various tales would be clubbed together. There will be parallel stories, parallel romantic stories going on. There would be a major protagonist, a hero and a heroine, but at the same time there would be other minor characters who also have this the romantic kind of image and the romance that's happening, a romantic tale that's moving within the play. The other aspect is the constant tangles of identity and even sex. There's a lot of confusion happening, and then leading to surprising reversals of situations. So there would be somebody in disguise, a male in a female disguise, a female in a male disguise, and so that tangle of identity is there. So that's why I say even sex, leading to surprising reversals of situations. And due to this kind of a tangle of identity, there is going to be a sudden change towards the end. You will also find that there's an occasional ridicule of manners or of the character types. The treatment of the characters primarily friendly rather than satirical. So it has been noticed that audience they do not really enjoy watching satire as much as they enjoy we're talking about a bigger audience. There's a very particular class of audience who would probably enjoy a satire, but it's a romantic comedy that is appreciated and liked by most of these audience. So satire is not something which is really liked. Realism and romance. So you will find that in most of these comedies that we discussed, there are some which are very realistic. Like when we talk about the comedy of manners, there is realism here. We talk about the dark comedy, there's realism here. And that is why that sometimes reality hurts, it's bitter. But at the same time there's romance, so there's a blend. You find the portrayal of the romantic middle class with poets' sympathy here. So the middle class of the London city is portrayed, but the poet actually sympathizes with these characters, because when a comedy is written, it is with an intention to make people laugh through the foibles and weaknesses of the English life, English people, and mildly satirical comedies of manners also are evident, which makes people laugh. We have to talk about Middleton and Fletcher. These are some of the examples that I'm giving, where you find those lowly characters who fall into types in classes. Each of these characters, lowly characters, would have the pet weaknesses or absurdity, something to enhance a comic effect. Something very peculiar, very strange, very absurd, or which is being highlighted. Play is built on big situations, crimes and passions. Characters underwent surprising transformation. Language that is used is very courtly, very polite and vernacular. If because you have to connect with the audience, so you cannot use very refined and polished kind of language. So it has to be very vernacular language which really hits off with the audience and they really enjoy. They sort of starts, they can connect. So the language is very important here. Most of the plots, they evolve out of clever intrigue. Plots become subordinate here, and at the same time, larger desire to satirize the various phases of urban life. So as the play started moving towards the urbanization, towards showing the urban city, the city life, then you'll find that there's a lot of satire which is being used. Fletcher's Comedies of Manners presented fascinating pictures of the city with little interest in satire. But it was Fletcher who did not much indulge in satire. He rather focused on very good picture of the city life. Characters were very, very sprightly and adventurous, and the action used to be very brisk and entertaining. So the main aim of the playwright is to entertain. Plot is packed with disguises and sudden and ill-motived turns. Romantic themes, even in his Comedy of Manners, you will find. Johnson's humor comedy, you will find that classical inspiration from Plautus and Terence. It is adapted specifically with English society or the local conditions in mind. Every Man in Humor, which was performed in 1598, as I said, Ben Jonson's most popular comedy of humor, a play of intrigue, there is deception, there's an Italian setting. This was what he had originally conceptualized. But then later on, when he had to perform it in England, he knew that he had to bring about a change. So it was rewritten. And these various characters were satirically interpreted, making scenes and characters, everything was converted into English, to localized treatment was given. Localizing treatment was characteristic of his work. That's what he did. He just modeled it on the Plautus and Terence kind of comedies, but then he made it very much localized for the English audience. He also developed the unity, making his plot appropriate to the weakness of his characters. This is portrayal of a peculiarity in each of his characters. Bitterness of Johnson's satire increased. Okay, now quickly we just sum up the 5 types of comedies that we discussed today. The romantic comedy,